Hi there, it's Dr. Brody with Chapter Four's audio lecture. I hope you all are having a great day so far. This chapter is all about how you became you. It's about the nature-nurture interaction, and I'm wondering if you ever thought about what made you you. I think about this all the time. I think about my parents who grew up in a different country. They grew up in India. And what if I had been born there instead of raised in North America? How might I be different? Would I have a different threshold for spicy food? It turns out I'm a pretty big baby when it comes to spicy food. But if you look at my parents, and when they go to a restaurant, they say, "We want whatever you've got, as spicy as you can make it." And I think, what role did my upbringing have in something like that? Would I have a life threatening food allergy if I had been raised elsewhere? Would my social attitudes be different? I mean, what really contributed to me being me? I think these questions are so interesting, and this chapter is full of fascinating examples about our environment, nurture, and our genes in biology, our nature. The overall picture is that these things work hand in hand. It's not that we are this much nature and this much nurture. It's really important to look at the evidence on each side for how important the roles of biology and environment are in shaping who we become together. I want to cover some things on the nature side, some things on the nurture side, and tell you some stories that I think are interesting from this chapter. There are some examples in the book that are really interesting, and while you're listening to this, I'd like to ask you to take a second to interlock your hands. All right, now look down. Which thumb is on top? I think I'm about to blow your mind because I'm going to guess your left thumb is on top. Am I right? It turns out that there's just one gene that determines this, and the left thumb on top is dominant. Who would have thought that that's a thing related to our DNA? How interesting. I want you to think about DNA and the relative contribution of each of our parents and how that shaped who we are. We also want to take a second to spotlight another one of our scholars now. Maybe somebody who doesn't get the attention she deserves. Maybe if you've taken a biology class, you've already learned about Rosalind Franklin. She's a very important researcher who studied X-ray crystallography. In her very famous picture, photo 51, is what led to the discovery of the double helix for DNA. She basically took this picture, did not get credit for it, was treated very badly in her lab, and experienced quite a bit of sexism. We know this because the people actually admitted to it later. The people who are the perpetrators of this really did not shy away from admitting it. They treated her very badly, they made fun of her appearance, and essentially stole her work without giving her proper credit. She ended up dying young, very likely due to the radiation associated with the x rays she was working with. She never really got to have or enjoy the success that was due to her hard work. So I want you to remember her name, Rosalind Franklin. There's also a term related to her that you might find interesting, the Matilda effect. The Matilda effect is when women's contributions are ascribed to men. This, unfortunately, has happened a lot in our field, just given the historical circumstances where our field emerged. The best we can do now is try to put a spotlight on it and give people the credit that they are due. During their lifetimes, they often did not receive credit for the work they had done. The least we can do is to give them some credit now. All right, so as we move forward in this chapter, we're going to focus first on the nature side of things. When we say nature, we mean biology and genes. Some of the interesting stories in the book have to do with identical twins who are reared apart. There are a number of these. In fact, there's actually a database of identical twins who have been reared apart. If you think about it, they're as close as we get to nature's own clones, though there are some differences in identical twins' DNA. Identical twins don't necessarily have the same number of copies of genes, but they're as close as we can get. When we take identical twins and they're reared apart, it's interesting to look at the ways in which they are similar or different later on. One of my favorite stories is the story of Jim Lewis and Jim Springer. Jim and Jim are a classic study in an intro psych class because the story is so wild. Jim and Jim were separated after just 37 days after birth. and they reunited when they were 38 years old. They get to talking and discovered they had some things in common. So let's go through the list of similarities. They both had a first wife whose name was Linda and a second wife whose name was Betty. They both named their sons James Allen. They both enjoyed woodworking, preferred Miller Lite. They both had had vasectomies. They were both chain smokers, and they both named their dog Toy. What on earth do you make about this list? Are these similarities because Jim and Jim had the same essential DNA, or is it something else? If we think more critically about the story of Jim and Jim, we might start to say, well, don't lots of people their age have terrible taste in beer and like Miller Lite? That's not necessarily related to DNA, but maybe chain smoking is. Was it in their DNA to marry women with the same names or to name their dog Toy? Or were those just really wild coincidences? When we think about it, if we're just looking for similarities, even with a stranger, we are going to find them. As kooky as that story is, we really have to put a critical eye on it and ask, how can we study this systematically? Researcher Thomas Bouchard is one of the people who has done this work, looking in a more systematic way at identical twins who have been reared apart. It turns out that there are some similarities found in identical twins despite being raised in different homes. Personality, intelligence, interests, specific fears, brain waves, and heart rates all show similarities. Those findings might give us pause and make us ask, why are they so similar many years, even sometimes decades, after being separated? So let's file that away as interesting. Well, what else is related to genes? We might also look at other data that shows a strong heritable component and focus on temperament. There seems to be a strong genetic component when it comes to temperament, which is a person's characteristic emotional reactivity and intensity. It usually is apparent in the first weeks of life and carries on through adulthood. I think there's some really interesting research that's actually not talked about in your book. As a parent, I find the concept of orchid children versus dandelion children fascinating. Orchid kids, as they're called, are highly sensitive to their environments, especially the quality of their parenting. Parenting really matters for these kids. Dandelion kids are more psychologically resilient. They seem to thrive in almost any circumstance. Some researchers are looking at a possible genetic factor that influences whether children are orchid or dandelion. So, for orchid children, the environment seems to matter a great deal. They're going to need much more responsive parenting to lead to positive outcomes later in life. To be clear, every child needs good parenting, but these orchid kids are especially sensitive to bad parenting. Another line of research looks at the role of nature through the famous fox study. The researchers started with 30 male and 100 female foxes. Over 30 generations of breeding, researchers selectively bred the tamest 5%. This took 40 years to do. You might wonder, how many foxes did this produce? Turns out 45,000. So 45,000 foxes later, they produced a fox that was docile, eager to please, and domestic. There's a whole new kind of fox at the end of this breeding process. When we look at selective breeding, we can see a strong genetic component. Researchers took the tamest 5%, bred them, repeated the process for 30 generations, and by the end, they had foxes that were very different from the original population. Also, on the nature side, we have a study that's kind of crazy to think about now because it's hard to imagine it being approved today. The Clark and Hatfield study that took place on a college campus. And I'm just going to say this outright, don't replicate this study on your own. The researchers had research assistants walk across a busy campus and approach someone of a different sex with the following statement. Let me get into character. I've been noticing you around campus, and I find you very attractive. Would you go to bed with me tonight? Can you even imagine that scenario? When they looked at the data later, first of all, wow, right? This is not going to pass through an institutional review board now. So when they looked at the data, it turned out that 0% of women said yes to this proposition, while 70% of men said yes. Think about that for a second. 0% of women said yes, 70% of men said yes. There's an evolutionary explanation given in the book that you'll want to read about regarding why women might be motivated to say no and why men might be motivated to say yes. So read and learn. On the other hand, we've got the nurture camp. Nurture is all about environment and how environmental influences shape who we are. We've got molecular genetics, and we have the introduction of the term epigenetics. When I was a student taking intro psych, I never learned about epigenetics. We're now living in a time where we understand that our experiences can change genetic expression. A study that you should be familiar with involves mother rats licking their pups versus pups that were deprived of that maternal licking. What researchers discovered was that the deprived pups developed more epigenetic marks that blocked the formation of stress hormone receptors. Those poor little rats started out stressed, and that early trauma made them less able to cope with future stressors in life. It's so sad. These epigenetic marks show how the environment can trigger or block genetic expression. Your experiences can change your genetic expression. If we think about nurture, we can also think about parents, peers, and culture. You should look up Orkney Island in Scotland. On this island, you'll see grocery stores with baby carriages parked outside and babies left in them. Can you even imagine going to Kroger or HEB and seeing a baby left outside in a baby carriage? What would have to exist in a culture for that to happen? Well, for one, we'd need a lot of social trust, wouldn't we? You'd have to trust that it's safe to do that. It's a much smaller culture, but it reflects a collective approach to child rearing, the it takes a village model. So make sure you're familiar with the characteristics of individualistic versus collectivist cultures. There's also a section at the end of the chapter where sex and gender are discussed. Be familiar with the terminology because people often use the wrong terms and get them confused. So I always like to give a riddle when I teach this unit. A father and son get in a car crash and are rushed to the hospital. The father dies. The boy is taken to the operating room, and the surgeon says, I can't operate on this boy because he's my son. How is this possible? I'll let you think about that. If an answer doesn't immediately come to mind, that's reflective of how we think about gender. This riddle is actually many, many decades old, and it still continues to stump people. You might ask yourself why this is a riddle at all. Why is it difficult for some people to come up with an answer so quickly? The traditional answer when this riddle was created was, and I'm going to say the answer, is that the surgeon was the mom. Of course, we can think of modern answers to this that were not what the original riddle writers were thinking of many decades ago, right? Could have been two dads, for example. Think about how gender, social power, social attitudes, differences in aggression, and things like social connectedness can be studied by researchers. There's even a documentary called The Mask You Live In that the library carries. It examines some of the pressures faced by boys and young men regarding emotional expression. One common assumption that you might hear people talk about is that women are more emotional than men. Maybe you've heard something along these lines. But it actually turns out that as humans, we all have emotions. The difference may actually be more about emotional expressivity rather than having emotions. So, what influences whether we express emotions or not? Well, nurture might help us out here. Nurture researchers talk a lot about the social factors that make it difficult for some, including young men, to express themselves outwardly. What's interesting is that when we look at young boys, we actually see a lot of emotional expression. So you might ask with your researcher hat on, what is happening to change that? So, this is a great opportunity to practice your analytical skills and ask what biological and social factors are influencing that change. I truly hope this chapter has given you an opportunity to reflect on what makes you you. How do your experiences shape you? How does your biology shape you? And who are you going to become based on this intersection? I hope you enjoyed thinking about these topics and that you will continue to think about them. Hope you have a great day. Take care. Bye bye.